To practical principles, practical prints. Today is Thoughtful Thursday, so let's talk about philosophy stuff. I haven't found a whiteboard that I like using yet, so forgive me for not having anything to display in that regard. I've still got the picture of what we did last time, but it's not letting me share that. So I have that for reference, and I'll try to share that at some point. But last time we were going over sensation, input, and trying to separate that from output, from action and actuators. The most interesting or most difficult scenario being thought, because in a sense, that one, it's very hard. Very hard to separate the thought being generated versus the thought being observed. And so like we've got, so I noted a couple scenarios. One of them is, what would it be like experiencing murdering someone when it's not you doing the actions? You're just observing the thoughts, the vision, the feelings of that action happening. And I mean, that's interesting. But I think I've concluded since then that it's a lot like reading a book, really, which, albeit a lot more limited in the sensation, you end up generating or emulating that yourself in your head. But I think the effect is about the same. Like, you can observe sensation input or emulate it without that becoming ingrained, in a sense, I guess was the point of that. But then the other scenario that we didn't quite finish going through is having two bodies, and you observe from one, but then you act through another, and what that would mean, and what that would be like, just to, I guess, to explore the relationship between sensation input and action output. So continuing on with that, separate them into two different rooms, two different hospital rooms, I would assume. And you can observe yourself lying in one hospital bed. You don't control how the head moves. You don't control how the eyeball chooses to focus on things or what it can see it's in its periphery, stuff like that. But then, for whatever reason, in this thought experiment, you can act through the other one. And I mean, last time we talked about how really, with that disconnect between them, the actions just don't make any sense. Because you could, I mean, we talked about being in a ditch last time, but you could be choking in the other hospital bed and not know it. You might have fallen out, you might be bleeding out, you could be singing, and who knows why. But there's like no correlation when you disconnect those. I mean, you stick them in the same room, and that'd probably be an interesting co-op game, which, I don't know, maybe somebody has done, maybe I would do, where you have to observe the other body so that you can then act, and then you've basically got two players staring at each other, or actually staring at themselves. Yeah, gets interesting. But then you could do things in a sensible manner, in a connected, logical. I don't know how balance would work in that scenario, but because I mean, like, that's, you're auto-correcting so often with that sort of action. Um, and maybe that's ingrained enough in the body that it can take care of that for the most part. But yeah, gets interesting there. So now let's focus on output, and let's disconnect sensation. So we have a body and we're choking or we're lying in a ditch and whatnot, and just what do the actions mean? Or do you even have actions? Because frankly, when you disconnect that sort of input, is there any reason, how would you even know you're doing something? So you're lying in the ditch. You wouldn't know if you're trying to push yourself up, but you could theoretically be doing that. So it gets very disconnected having actions without input. And for all you know, you could be like trying to fall asleep with that body. And you might already be asleep. You might be falling asleep. You might be wide awake because there's caffeine in the body or something. Who knows? So it's very, having that disconnect kind of speaks to, well, at least in these thought experiments, it speaks to why the localization of input and output is important. And I guess because not all of that would go to you, the person, your spirit, thought, brain, whatever. Because like when you go for a checkup to the doctors, they'll sit you on that table and you'll hit your knee and your knee will swing. That's, I mean, eventually that'll reach your brain. But that's, you're kicking, your body's reflexively doing that. So, I mean, there is input going somewhere, and then eventually continuing on in some form up to the brain and the head, whatnot. But then you've already got output going out. So at least in the human experience, we've got this fuzzy relationship between input and output. And so there's that example of input fuzzily and automatically, in a sense, going back to output. And then you've got, like, how to phrase that? You've got scenarios where you intend to do something, but you don't execute it in that way. So like practicing any instrument or any sport. I mean, eventually you get to the point where it's natural or automatic, but for a while, you're going to make mistakes, overshoot or undershoot, and occasionally get it in the rim. And over time, that gets better. But there's, I don't know that it's a disconnect, but there's the fuzzy relationship between you know what you want to accomplish and then what actually happens, maybe disconnected from that. Well, not disconnected, but it doesn't perfectly mirror that. Because you aren't just what you want to be. There are plenty of things you've told yourself you wouldn't do or said you would do, and then you failed. Either you swore off drinking and then you drank, same thing with smoking, or you said you were going to win the arm wrestling with your friend or something and then lost. So you can only impose so much upon reality through this imperfect mechanism of your body. And like other people have like very precise control of their body, like gymnasts and whatnot. when you get into that sort of stuff. And so their control, in a sense, is very fine, very precise. That doesn't mean that they've got a perfect mastery of execution of this thing will be this outcome. And that's partly because like you don't have a perfect understanding of reality. Like you standing on the table, don't know why you would, and then someone pulls out the cloth underneath you. I guess you would be standing on the rug, and somebody pulls out the rug underneath you. Like if you don't know that's coming, I don't know why you would be thinking about standing there being still, but you trying to impose that existence, that being, doesn't translate. It's not a perfect translation by any means. You will fall and get hurt unexpectedly for you. So yeah, there's that disconnect. And so how much, so I guess let me make notes for myself. There's the fuzzy input output. And we're mostly talking about output in this case. Fuzzy imposition on world. And then I think that's our big thing, because a lot of this was related to sensation from last time. Yeah, I guess one thing we didn't touch about, or well, we talked about last time, but I haven't touched on yet, was lies and misunderstandings. Because there's two types of lies. There's the ones that the assumptions or the fallacies that you tell yourself, and then there's others that are suggested. So there's lies you generate and then lies that come from outside of you. And one of the best examples of that external is like a magician's show, because the magician is suggesting that he can make things appear and disappear. And to someone who's wise or someone in on the trick, like they can see through that. But we can tell, and you may have been such a person at one time, some people will believe the magic, even though that interpretation of reality isn't accurate. And then we talked about how focus can clarify as well as cloud. Because by zooming in on that one thing, you've got a lot of attention on that, but then you also lose attention on the other things that you otherwise might pick up on. Like when someone's intensely reading a book and don't hear their name being called and something like that. Your focus is here, and there's no reason you can't hear them, but because of that focus, your other sense isn't triggering to the same level. Okay, and then back to output, fuzzy input, output, and then importance of the localized input with output, I/O. Because yeah, when you disconnect things, that's, yeah, gets interesting. And so another thing to continue on to, I mean, I naturally want to go to accountability, but of course, if you believe in predeterminism, fate, etc., like all those actions are set in stone. And so why whoever designed or created such a system, or how it naturally came to be, why it bothers with input, who knows? Because I mean, as a maker, you probably wouldn't create something that can take input that doesn't then translate that into some sort of output. So maybe in the grand scheme, like having that input is important for achieving the output they wanted. for this play to go on, you've got to hear the other actor cite their line so that you can then cite your own and continue with the charade. But then, like, when you have that sort of fate, that destiny, like justice and whatnot, doesn't really have a meaning. Like, it's all arbitrary in a sense, because it was set up and it's just the machine continuing in motion. So like the fact that someone is a murderer, kills somebody, like, are they really accountable when they were made to be that way under that ideology? Yeah, I don't really understand why there is that. I mean, there's definitely, in a lot of religions, there's a sort of predeterminism. I think that might be the right word, where there's a fate in a sense. And I mean, coming from a God that knows and understands better than a mortal does on like a hyper level, or whatever your supernatural higher power is, I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that they can do the calculations, computations. They know you well enough that it's going to go this way or it's going to go that way. And there's minuscule details that will play, won't really impact that. Just like, I mean, you can know someone so well that you know what they're going to do. And if you can do that, certainly a God could do that better and bigger. That is with the premise of a God and whatnot. So I guess predeterminism, it doesn't entirely contradict freedom, agency. But it's not necessarily, I mean, some people might say it's the same as, fate or destiny. But there's probably gradations there we're dealing with. So freedom / agency, and then predetermined, or rather predeterminism, I think, and then fate, destiny. And frankly, I don't know why you would like to say that everything is fated or destiny. That just doesn't seem practical, particularly with respect as justice, as I touched on earlier. Just because like wrongs done to you had to be done to you, because that's the way it was fated to be. And so you complaining about that would be fated. You not complaining and turning the other cheek, that would be fated. So, I mean, like, what is the point of that? Unless we're all just some grand play for someone else's amusement, which maybe you really believe. But I certainly don't find that particularly useful in practice. So, but we can dig into that more another time. Let's get back. Actuators, outputs. So accountability. So there's, with that fuzziness, you get into situations where there's reflex as well as intention. So when, so like I had a friend with a martial arts teacher who got into an accident and was thrown off his motorcycle. And while that was totaled, like his body knew how to handle that and just did a perfect little tumble, and he was unscathed. So there's like, are you accountable for that sort of reflex? And in a sense, he is. Like, he developed that ability, that reflex to act in that way. But in the heat of the moment, was he actively doing anything? No. I mean, to do a different dimension, like with finances and whatnot, there's you intentionally saving a little bit and investing it, but then are you accountable for how that performs and presumably eventually grows into a sizable sum? To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. So it's, yeah, I guess it depends on how much context you want to put behind something. Because in the case of the accident, for example, perfect tumble, like, he's not actively doing something. I mean, his body is reacting in a way that he has designed and practiced. But, and so when you, in just that context, you wouldn't say he's accountable. But in the larger context of he's developed this behavior, you would say he is. So does context determine accountability? And I think you see that to some extent in law, at least in the US, there's the idea of a reasonable person. Would a reasonable person do this thing, not do this thing, blah, 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 blah. And based off of what you think a reasonable person would do, did this person act negligently or maliciously, stuff like that. And obviously, like, with enough foresight, when you zoom out enough context, well, no, that's getting off of accountability. Does context determine accountability? Question mark. Because there's definitely very reactive people. You'll see that a lot in relationships where, like, when they talk about like pushing your buttons or triggering you, like, your response is in a sense programmed and is automatic. That response might be good, might be bad. But so in the heat of that moment, are you accountable? And most of the time in a relationship, people would say yes. They certainly act like it. When you retort in a scathing way, that hurts, and that person's gonna, whoever took the brunt of that, probably going to get some distance or react offensively to suppress. But yeah, but I mean, larger picture, are they, because they've developed that in a sense, although I don't know that most people actively do that. Sometimes it's just they've never like actively thought about it. It's just the default setting in a sense, and then it got hard-coded, maybe mutated a little based off of different experiences, different relationships. So, but I wouldn't I would still hold them accountable for responding that way, and I think most people would. So, but really, that's a reflex. Um, so I guess context, I mean, you're still accountable for what you do, I guess. So I think our answer is no. Um, and we'll cite relationships. So relationships. Okay. So basically, you would, under that thinking, you would always be accountable for what you're doing / not doing, because inaction is an action. Um, yeah, that's so. Most people just not think about what they're doing. So to a certain extent, that's true. I mean, what's worked before will usually continue to work. So it makes sense that they might not have had to actively figure out the flaws in what they're doing, or really observe and then fix. So I guess it's, so are they accountable to actually do that at some point? Is that something? So I guess I don't expect that of people. Like, it'd be good. I think that'd be wise, and a person probably should do that. But I don't know that I would expect everybody to do that. In which case, I guess that gets back to the reasonable man idea, because not everybody is reflective, introspective, digging into that sort of stuff. So it makes sense that they wouldn't, but that, I guess that means they own the defaults, which is convenient and largely works. Um, Otherwise, you probably would have run into an incident early on and had to revise it. So there, yeah, that's rough. Because on the one hand, we want to hold them accountable, but on the other hand, would they really? We don't really expect them to dig down like that. Yikes. Expect reflective introspection. Mm-hmm. And that kind of creates a conflict on what we might say we could expect of someone. That's rough. So if we don't expect them to be introspective, reflective, and to really decide things for themselves, but do we still just hold them accountable for that? I mean, as a person, I probably wouldn't to some extent. I would be extending mercy, forgiveness, whatever you want to call that. But on a societal level, like they've done a wrong. and it doesn't. I guess the reasons why. You might have bad reasons. Now, you don't really lose your accountability. We don't necessarily expect you to have been that wise, reflective, whatnot. That's interesting. Okay. Well, and that's getting more into society and whatnot. And eventually that'll get to political philosophy and group behavior, stuff like that. And we want to keep things localized to the single person first and work that out. So let's decide our next topic, and maybe we do talk on, what do we talk on? Agency and whatnot, and predeterminism. Any thoughts? You can suggest topics too if you want. Yeah, I think that might be a natural next segment, because, I mean, we're talking about today actuators and action. So that does kind of tie into agency or fate, that spectrum we talked about earlier. So maybe that'll just be our next topic. Okay, yeah, I guess this was a shorter one. Oh, yeah, still half an hour. But yeah, let's plan on the agency destiny spectrum next time, and just get some thoughts down on that, and then figure out where we want to go at from there. So thanks for watching, listening. Tomorrow we'll do Fun Friday. Planning on tarot again, just because, well, I mean, trying to figure out a setup for video games or board games. Not my current priority as far as the streaming stuff goes, and YouTube only recently got set up, so the tarot stuff that we had on Twitch will eventually disappear just because of their policies and whatnot. I probably won't ask the same questions again. So maybe I'll download that episode and upload it somewhere. Just because I'm not very fond of asking the same questions of tarot cards or any cards really. Because there's no reason to think you should get the same answer, and if you thought you could get an answer, who are you getting that from, and why would they give you the same answer every time? At a certain point, you're being disrespectful. So yeah. So tentatively tarot tomorrow. Well, almost assuredly tarot tomorrow. And then we'll talk about scheduling and what we're going to do next week, Monday. So thanks for tuning in, and